Okay, thank you very much. So I am going to discuss nocturnal pop music through the example of Lou Reed. So Lou Reed was born in 1942 in Brooklyn, New York, and he was a singer-songwriter who rose to fame with the avant-garde band The Velvet Underground in the late 1960s, which he formed with viola player John Cale. So the band notably released the now famous The Velvet Underground and Nico in 1967, which was their first record, which was produced by Andy Warhol. And so after The Velvet Underground disbanded in 1971, Lou Reed started a solo career that lasted until his death in 2013, and which spanned over 40 years and explored many genres of music from pop rock to harsh noise. And he produced famous hits such as Walk on the Wild Side in 1972. Furthermore, Reed, both in solo and with the Velvet Underground, is a pioneer of queer representation in rock music. From sadomasochism to transgender identity, Reed wrote about gender and sexuality in ways that were brand new to pop music of the time. From the noisy tracks of the Velvet Underground to his pop ventures on the 1989 record New York, the night has been a recurring theme and setting in Lou Reed's career, leading Warhol to crown him as, I quote, the Prince of the Night. In 2018, transgender musician Ezra Furman dedicated a book to Lou Reed's Transformer, which you can see on my slideshow. She wrote, his sexuality was deeply interwoven with his interest in music and art. By that, she means that Lou Reed's sexuality as a queer bisexual man is heavily linked to his music, his writing, and queerness has been a heavy influence on Reed's work. And that leads us to the following question. How does Lou Reed represent the night as a moment for radical transgression? In order to try and answer this question, we shall first see the elements that make Lou Reed one of the first musicians to refer to queer individuals. Then we shall discuss the night in relation to gender and sexuality in Lou Reed's work. And finally, we will theorize the fact that Lou Reed sometimes uses the night as a background to tell stories, whether they are queer or not, all while keeping our approach as chronological as possible, starting with the very first tracks from the Velvet Underground to Reed's solo career. And so I'm going to move on to my very first part about Lou Reed and queer representation. Indeed, from the very first recordings of the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed has been passionate with the idea of depicting sexualities that are considered as non-acceptable by society. According to queer theorist Gail Rubin, in the 1950s in the United States, there has been a movement to compress the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior. Indeed, in the post-war world, the vision of sex in America was very much tied to the Christian values that largely dominated the country. As such, a lot of sexual practices were deemed unacceptable. For example, sex outside of marriage, sex for pleasure, or homosexuality were heavily frowned upon by America, by the American culture. In the 1960s, however, countercultural discourses appeared, and sexual liberation became one of the demands of the burgeoning movements, such as the hippie movement, or as we were going to see, the New York artistic avant-garde. So amidst this cultural turmoil, the Velvet's description of perversities such as sadomasochism, homosexuality, and transsexuality transformed rock and roll discourse, as Bannister said in a 2010 article about Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. So in a time where the most daring thing in rock and roll history had been Elvis Presley's dance, Lou Reed's lyrics were almost dangerous. They seemed dangerous to the American culture of the time. The first record of the band, so the Velvet Underground and Nico, contains a song entitled Venus in Furs. It's inspired by the Leopold von Sacher-Masoch book of the same name, and the song is an ode to sadomasochism. It contains several references to S&M accessories, such as the whip or the leather. The song tells the story of a sadomasochistic relationship in which Severin, which is the main character from Sacher-Masoch's book, gets dominated by a woman. The song heavily implies that the scene takes place at night, Lou Reed referring notably to streetlight fancies, which can be interpreted as a sex shop illuminating the night in which the mistress chases the costumes she shall wear. She looks for accessories to wear for the relationship. So the song may not be queer in itself, but its representation of sadomasochism definitely makes it a seminal song for queer representation in pop music. Indeed, I quote, sadomasochism, it has been claimed, is a process of invention insofar as it detaches sexual pleasures from sexuality and frees bodily pleasures from exclusive localization in the genitals. Indeed, with S&M, the use of sex is recontextualized, and it questions gender hierarchies. In a sadomasochistic practice, men and women are no longer the most defining qualities for the people that take part in a relationship. What matters is dominant and submissive rather than man and woman. In this sense, sadomasochism can be considered as some form of queer relationship. And Venus in Furs, in this sense, is a very important song for the history of queer rock, especially because it is in strong contrast to the peace and love ethos of sexual liberation advocated by hippies. It's not about peace and love, it's about violent sex, brutal with whips and leather, everything described in the song. So in 1968, a year after Venus in Furs, the Velvet Underground released a song that is much more explicit in terms of queerness. It's the song Sister Ray on the record White Light, White Heat. The song is a 17 minutes descent into harsh noise, ending in a wall of guitars devoid of any melody whatsoever. But the lyrical content of the song is what matters the most to us now. The song tells the story of a drug-filled orgy during which a man gets killed and everyone is too drugged to even notice that someone died. There is an overarching character in the song. It's the eponymous Sister Ray, who is a drag queen who seemingly organized the orgy, given that every other character, I quote the song, does it just like Sister Ray said. She seems to be the mistress of the orgy. The song refers to oral sex through the lines, you busy sucking on my ding-dong, for example. Hey, hey, she's busy sucking on my ding-dong. Through its use of sexual imagery and the presence of a drag queen as the main character of the song, Sister Ray is probably one of the most explicit Velvet Underground songs in terms of queerness, but there are many other songs that deal with queerness. For example, Candy Says or Lady Godiva's Operation, which both refer to transgender women. However, Venus in Furs and Sister Ray seem to be the most relevant here because they both tell a story that takes place at night. So now, as I just mentioned, I am going to talk about Lou Reed, queerness, and the night. As Jarek Irvin wrote in a 2019 book entitled Nocturnes, Popular Music and the Night, New York's queer world was rooted in darkness. Thus, in Lou Reed's work, queerness is heavily intertwined with the night. And this is something that's even more obvious in his solo career. So after leaving the Velvet Underground in 1971, Reed released a record entitled Transformer in 1972. The record, which was produced by famous singer David Bowie, features several songs that refer to queerness. And it also features Lou Reed's most famous song, Walk on the Wild Side, which appeared on the A side of the album. The song consists in, I quote Ezra Furman, a pop music microcosm of queers entering the mainstream consciousness. Indeed, it is composed of several stanzas, each describing a character from Andy Warhol's factory, which was his workshop in New York. And most of those characters are queer. Reed notably refers in the first stanza of the song to Holly Woodlawn, who was a transgender actress. He refers to her gender transition, singing "Shave the legs," and then he was a she. She says, "Hey babe, take a walk on the wild side." But for us, this is not the most interesting part of the song. The ones that matter the most for us are the second and third verses of the song, because the Holly Woodlawn verse does not refer to night per se. The second verse of the song is about another transgender actress from Warhol's factory, Candy Darling, the same one that was already mentioned in the Velvet Underground song Candy Says. So in Walk on the Wild Side, Candy Darling is described in the following lines. In the back room, she was everybody's darling, but she never lost her head even when she was giving head, which is a reference to oral sex. The word backroom itself is heavily associated with both queerness and the night. The back rooms were the dark rooms that were located at the back of some gay clubs, especially in New York, and in which customers often had sex with each other at night. So that is something that sort of links queerness and the night together. And the next stanza also blends the two because it refers to Little Joe. So Little Joe is a character. It's the nickname used for Joe D'Alessandro, who was one of Warhol's most famous actors. And he appeared as a male hustler, sex worker, in Warhol's movie Flesh. And the song mentions this idea of sex work through the lines, a hustle here and a hustle there. New York City is the place where they say, take a walk on the wild side. So in both cases, I quote, the title phrase is spoken in character. It's like an invitation to discover the nocturnal world of queer New York. So the night no longer serves as a setting like in Venice and First. It is much more than that. It is a whole world of possibilities, of new things to discover and try. However, much later, in 1989, what was a world of wonder had become a time of pain. So on the New York record, there is a track entitled New Halloween Parade. The title Halloween Parade refers to the New York City Halloween Parade that usually takes place on the night of Halloween. The song opens with Reed as a spectator of the parade, talking about drag queens that are missing from the event. Quickly, the song evolves into a grim assessment of the situation. As Lou Reed sings, it's a different feeling that I have today, especially when I know you've gone away. So the song was written a few years after the beginning of the AIDS outbreak. It's a tribute from Lou Reed to his friends who passed away because of the disease. Being a bisexual man from New York, Lou Reed saw a lot of his acquaintances die from AIDS. So in Halloween Parade, the night starts as a moment that is supposed to be cheerful, of queer joy, but it quickly becomes the symbol of the impending doom that awaits the queer community because of AIDS. So now I'm going to discuss briefly Lou Reed and the night as a setting. Because even if the main topic of this presentation is the night in relation to queerness, the night is also a very important theme in other songs and in other works by Lou Reed. For example, I'm thinking of Andy Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable. So it was a show that took place, it was planned as a total work of art by Andy Warhol, and it took place at the end of the 60s. Many of Lou Reed's actors were involved. So the show itself, I quote, had much of the trash quotient with which Warhol had become almost eponymous. And as such, it took place at night. It was a performance during which Warhol's movies were played in the background, while the Velvet Underground played noisily. And all that occurred while photographer Gerald Malenga was getting whipped by actress Eddie Sedgwick. The sadomasochistic and transgressive aesthetic of the exploding plastic inevitable is inherently queer. It could have been discussed earlier, but it's also revealing of Lou Reed's obsession with scenes of wild trash parties filled with drugs, sex, and rock music, the same kind of parties which he often wrote about in his songs. He also mentioned the night, for example, in a 1973 song entitled The Bed, in which he mentioned a character who commits suicide at night. But since I am running out of time, unfortunately, I am going to have to conclude now. So as a pioneer of queer representation in pop music, Lou Reed mentioned the night a lot in his work. And since queer life was often associated with the night, as we've seen, especially in New York, he mentioned the night a lot too. Given the social cultural context of the time, most of his representation are linked to promiscuous lifestyles involving male sex work, sex in back rooms, S&M and drugs, and all that was being associated with the night. It is only logical that the night would not only be a setting, but more of a character itself. It is the character that brings new possibilities and sometimes brings death, as we've seen. And as such, maybe Reed's lyrics may not seem that transgressive today because things have changed and are still changing. But in the late 60s and in the early 70s, talking about transgender people, about sadomasochism, was much more rare. And that is why I quote Reed's song as enjoyed a striking half-life, earning a central place in the mainstream of popular music. In this quote, Jarek Irvin was talking about Walk on the White Side, but this is something that we could say about every song that Lou Reed wrote when it comes to queerness, because he really pioneered that. Thank you very much. So in a 1955 article entitled Introduction to a Critique of Urban Geography, French sociologist and philosopher Guy Debord theorized the concept of psychogeography, which he defined as such: the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So Debord's concept was aimed at real-life architecture, but in films, visual cues are among the most important ways to convey meaning. The way things are presented to viewers, visually speaking, has an impact on the reception of the movie and its themes. So our focus is going to be on two different movies. The first one is a Japanese movie entitled Funeral Parade of Roses, which was released in 1969. And the second one is a French movie from 2017 entitled 120 BPM. In both movies, the night serves a major purpose, and as such, many places are associated with it, each having an influence on the way these themes are perceived. Furthermore, both movies revolve around queerness. The first one is about transgender women in Japan, and the second one is about ACT UP Paris. Thus, we may ask ourselves, how does psychogeography influence the perception viewers have of queerness in both films? So in order to study said films, we shall first discuss each movie separately, starting with Funeral Parade of Roses. And once we've discussed the particularities of each movie, we are going to discuss a major common point between both movies, the nightclub bar. So
now I shall talk about places of the night in Funeral Parade of Roses, as she said. I have to specify, though, that I'm going to refer to a lot of characters as transgender women because of the ambiguity of gender and because it is a movie released in the 60s. They are referred in the movie as gay boys, but it will be transgender women for this paper. So now this movie is directed by Toshio Matsumoto and could be classified as a neo-documentary. It is basically a movie form of what he wrote in Eizo no Aken, which is a manifesto where he's trying to create a new subgenre of cinema. Excuse me, I haven't just... Est-ce que je peux genre bouger là un truc? Parce qu'en fait, j'ai besoin de lire ma côte en fait. Sorry, I just... Well, that's okay. So he's basically stating in his manifesto that, and I'm quoting Splinter that you can see on the screen, that filmmakers need to make a balance between the subjective inner world and the objective outer world. And that is a pretty interesting take because it is really close to what Debord is saying about psychogeography. Because psychogeography is basically a technique that has a goal to merge objective and subjective feelings toward diverse environments. And that is precisely what Matsumoto is doing, but in a cinematographic way. So in some terms, cinema is one of the best medium, I would say, to represent and create a psychological map. So now about the story, I'm gonna just give you a little bit of context, but it's basically the story of Eddie, who is a transgender woman who works at a gay bar called Jeunet, and she's having some rivalry issues with another transgender woman, with the madam, the leader host of the gay bar. So, but what is pretty interesting for this paper is that one of the main character, excuse me, one of the main character of the movie is Shinjuku itself. It is basically a film that depicts life of the city from morning to night. So we can say that the movie is basically a city symphony of Shinjuku. To give you some context of Shinjuku at these times, it is a city that has a lot of happenings going on. There's a lot of students that are heavily inspired by American happenings, and there are a lot of happenings going on in the city, and there's a lot of power plays. There is authorities who are trying to change the architectures of the whole city in order to prevent and to repress social gatherings. And that's what we can see also in the movie. So about the night times in the movie, there are a lot of scenes that occur in the bedrooms, obviously. There are a lot of queer lives that is going on in these environments. We have also the movie who begins with close-ups of bodies, and that shows, I'm going to quote Hintelton, not only does funeral focus on the human landscape, as it were, it also shows in the following scene in Gondaskar that subjectively is inextricably tied to the social space of the city. So the characters are part of the city themselves. We have also scenes in Guevara. Sorry, I have struggled to say his name. But basically, this is scenes where there is a lot of psychogeographical view, because they're just all of the characters are just taking drugs in the underground and watching experimental movies. And that's basically what Debord is saying when he's explaining psychogeography, when he's saying that psychogeography is a purposeful drift through the city, and this is basically what they're also doing. And finally, you have the documentary side, where you can see streets of Shinjuku at night, and where there are transgender women who are talking about how they prefer life at night, basically because that's where they can be there themselves, and that's it. And
so now we're going to move on to the places of the night in 120 BPM. So as I said, it's a French movie that talks about ACT Paris, so the Parisian branch of anti-AIDS organization ACT UP. It takes place in the mid-1990s, and many different places are explored throughout the movie. And 4 of them take place at night. So the first one is the University Lecture Hall, which is the very first place we see in the movie. It is where the weekly meetings of ACT UP take place, and they take place at night from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. And so this lecture hall is very interesting because throughout the movie, we see a lot of arguments happen in this place, and it sort of lacks sense of community because of the diversity of people in the organization. And there are a lot of people, they sometimes argue with each other because they don't always agree. And that is something that is shown through the polyrhythmics, cacophonies that infiltrate their weekly meetings, I'm quoting. The room, and this is shown because the room is divided into small groups. And technically speaking, we see that thanks to the back and forth of the camera between several groups, which shows this lack of harmony. And it would have been impossible in a smaller, more narrow room. So that's why the lecture hall is important. Next, we have the bedroom. I'm sorry, the screenshots are very dark, so I'm going to explain them. So it's the main character's bedroom. His name is Nathan, and he spends most of his time in his bedroom with his lover, Sean. In the bedroom, the viewers are reminded that for most gay men, sex involves a far broader degree of general eroticized physical contact, in which fucking and sucking are episodes of intimacy, among others. So the bedroom, like most places in the movie, is an ambivalent place. It's a place of tenderness, of intimacy, because that's where they have sex, they learn more about each other, they talk, but that is also a place of death, because towards the end of the movie, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to spoil it for you, but one of the characters dies, and it happens in the bedroom, and it is still a place of intimacy, but for much darker reasons. Now I'm going to discuss the street, because that's where the climax of the movie takes place. It takes place as activists from ACT UP take to the street and for a protest, and they march at night in the street. This scene is a reminder that queer space is appropriation and imagination, I'm quoting, because taking control of the space as queer people also means appropriating it and its meaning. And it's very important in this scene because there is a die-in. This is the form they choose for the protest. And in this scene of die-in, visual language turns the street into a mass grave through the presence of crosses and bodies. It looks like a graveyard or a mass grave, as I said, and it is a reminder that AIDS is a deadly disease at that time. In the same sense, this idea of reappropriation is particularly relevant because for many queer people, the street, especially at night, is a place where violence can be anywhere. And thus, seeing a group of queer activists take over the street is a way to depict their agency and to show their will to exist in public spaces. So regarding the private-public opposition I just mentioned, in 120 BPM, I'm quoting, the body can be more liberated to produce and experience the space in the private area compared to the public one. In the film, private spaces are places where the characters can be free. They are free to have sex, they are free to get to know each other, they are free to argue, whereas the outside, the public places are the places where they are faced with heteronormativity and the places that crush the character. Because I'm going back to the screenshot of the street, given how high the street, the walls are in the street, it feels like the characters are imprisoned in the street. So now we're going to move on to the nightclub bar, because it is a very important part of queer culture, and as such, it is a very important element in both movies. So the space of the club may play an important role because of the heteronormative institutions that dominate daily spaces. The nightclub, for many queer people who have already been in a bar or a nightclub, it feels like the only place, public place where they can be themselves without fear of violence, without fear of getting beat up on the streets. And that is something that is very important. As such, even if it's a public place, the nightclub or the gay bar can easily feel like a private place, the only place that does not abide by heteronormative rules. Furthermore, the time space of clubbing, I quote, is often perceived in a territorially domestic sense, which is something we see in both movies. The club feels like a place where the characters are at home, where they can be themselves. In 120 BPM, they can just dance and forget their activism for at least one night. And in Funeral Parade of Roses, they can be themselves, they can live their gender identity without fear of violence. Something very important too is the dance. The dance in both movies can be argued as inherently queer. I quote, "The dream of the dance make identities wobble and identifiers are blurred, overturned, and deconstructed." And instead, in those dancing scenes, the proximity between characters highlight for 120 BPM, both the solidarity between the protagonists, but since those identities are blurred and they kind of hit each other and they are very close, it also implies that the virus is transmitting, which is something we see metaphorically in the movie, because the dust from the nightclub turns into virus shapes. And so we're going to move on to the conclusion now, because we're running out of time. Sorry. So as we have seen throughout the presentation, despite the very few common points between the two movies, they both provide very interesting insights regarding queerness, especially through the use of geography and specific locations, such as the nightclub. The location depicted in both movies serve a very important purpose when it comes to the depiction of a queer way of seeing the world. Those queer representations are also a resistant move, because as Guy Debord said about psychogeography, there is nothing to be expected until the masses in action awaken to the conditions and to the practical means of changing them. That is why a queer reading of common places such as the nightclub or the street is very important, because it allows the authors, or in this case the directors, to take control of the narrative and to write stories about queer agency in a heteronormative society. And that's it. Thank you very much.